Driver gives a lift to lonely old woman in the middle of nowhere, stops cold when she says her name. The dashboard clock blinked 2:47 a.m. as Daniel crosses 18-wheeler carved through the darkness of Highway 23. The gentle rumble of the engine had long since become white noise, a constant companion on these endless night runs. Snowflakes danced in his high beams, creating an almost hypnotic tunnel of white that stretched endlessly into the void ahead. Daniel adjusted his thermos of lukewarm coffee, his calloused fingers finding the familiar dents and scratches on the metal surface. 23 years of long-haul trucking had taught him that loneliness was just another part of the cargo, as constant as the diesel in his tanks and the weight behind his cab. The radio crackled, breaking his trance. Static burst through the speakers, drowning out the late-night talk show he'd been half listening to. Daniel reached for the dial, his wedding ring catching the dim light of the instrument panel, a reminder of another failed attempt at normalcy, another relationship crushed under the wheels of his perpetual motion. "Damn mountain interference," he muttered, though he knew there weren't any mountains for miles. The static grew louder, taking on an almost rhythmic quality, like whispered words just beyond comprehension. The temperature gauge on his dashboard dropped suddenly, the needles swinging toward the blue zone despite the heater running full blast. That's when he saw her. The figure appeared so suddenly in his headlights that Daniel's heart lurched against his ribs. His foot instinctively moved to the brake, but years of experience kept him from slamming it. At first, he thought it was a trick of light on snow, or maybe fatigue playing with his mind. But as he drew closer, the figure solidified, an elderly woman, standing perfectly still on the shoulder, one arm extended in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. "Jesus Christ!" Daniel breathed, his hands tightening on the wheel. He was 40 miles from the nearest town, in the dead of winter, on a stretch of road locals called the Dead Zone, because of its lack of cell service. What was she doing out here? Common sense screamed at him to keep driving. In all his years on the road, he'd made it a point never to pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories, too many risks. But something about the woman's solitary figure in his rearview mirror tugged at him. She wore what looked like an old-fashioned wool coat, the kind his grandmother might have worn, and her silver hair gleamed in the red glow of his taillights. "Damn it!" he growled, and began the careful process of bringing his rig to a stop. The brakes hissed like a mechanical snake as he pulled onto the shoulder, snow crunching under his tires. In his side mirror, he watched the woman slowly approach, her movements careful and deliberate on the icy ground. The passenger door creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air that seemed to drop the temperature in the cab by 20 degrees. The woman climbed in with surprising grace for her age, settling into the seat without a word. Up close, Daniel could see her clothes were oddly dated, not just the coat, but everything about her seemed to belong to another era. Her gloves were hand-knitted wool, and a delicate brooch in the shape of a forget-me-not flower pinned her scarf in place. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. "Not many would these days." "It's dangerous to be out here alone, ma'am," Daniel replied, checking his mirrors before pulling back onto the highway. "Especially on a night like this. Where are you headed?" The woman's hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "I just need to get home," she said, the same slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Something about that smile made the hair on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. "And where's home?" he pressed, trying to keep his voice casual. The static on the radio had subsided, but now only silence came from the speakers, not even the usual background hiss of a dead channel. "Oh, you know the way," she replied, and Daniel felt his stomach drop. He hadn't told her which direction he was traveling, yet she seemed perfectly confident in his route. The snow was falling heavier now, the flakes fat and wet against his windshield. His wipers pushed them aside in rhythmic arcs, but they seemed to be moving slower than usual, creating a dreamlike quality to the scene before him. The woman hadn't moved since sitting down, hadn't even shifted in her seat or reached to adjust the heater. She sat perfectly still, like a photograph come to life. "I should introduce myself," she said suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "My name is Eleanor Cross." Daniel's hands jerked on the wheel, sending the truck swaying slightly before he corrected it. Eleanor Cross. His mother's name. The same name that had been carved into a headstone 30 years ago, after the accident that had torn his family apart. That's quite a coincidence, he managed, his voice rough. I had a relative by that name. Did you? The woman asked, and now she turned to look at him for the first time. Her eyes caught the green glow of the dashboard lights, reflecting them back like a cat's. Tell me about her, Daniel. He never told her his name. Daniel's throat felt dry as sandpaper as he stared straight ahead at the snow-covered road. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he'd mentioned his name without realizing it. Maybe she'd seen it on his truck's documentation. Maybe this was all just some strange coincidence. But deep down, he knew none of those explanations made sense. You look just like him, you know, Eleanor said, her voice taking on a wistful quality. Your father, I mean. James always had that same fro between his eyebrows when he was worried about something. The truck's engine stuttered for a moment, as if responding to Daniel's racing heart. Nobody had mentioned his father's name in years. After the accident, James Cross had become a ghost himself, drowning his grief in whiskey until he finally disappeared altogether, leaving 12-year-old Daniel to be raised by his aunt in Minneapolis. I don't know who you are, Daniel said, his voice harder than he intended. But this isn't funny. My mother died 30 years ago in a car accident on Miller's Bridge. I was there. I saw it happen. Eleanor's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked impossibly sad. Is that what you remember, Little Bear? The nickname hit him like a physical blow. Little Bear, his mother's special name for him, because he'd been born on the first snow of winter, while bears were settling into their dens. He never told anyone about that nickname, not even his ex-wife during their 8 years of marriage. Stop it, he whispered, but his voice shook. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes looking almost black against his headlights. The temperature gauge had dropped even further, and his breath was starting to fog in the air despite the heater running at full blast. You were always such a sensitive child, Eleanor continued, as if she hadn't heard him. Remember how you used to leave out honey sandwiches for the Rio Bears? You were convinced they'd come right up to our back porch. She laughed softly. Your father was so angry when he found out, but I couldn't bear to tell you to stop. You had such a gentle heart. Memories flooded back unbidden, the sticky sweetness of honey on his fingers, his mother's laughter as she helped him wrap the sandwiches in wax paper, his father's gruff voice lecturing them about attracting wildlife. Details he thought he'd forgotten, buried under 3 decades of running away. The morning it happened, Eleanor said, her voice growing distant. You were wearing your red wool sweater. The one I knitted for your birthday. It had a bear on the front, remember? You were so proud of it, you wore it every chance you got, even when it was too warm for wool. Daniel's hands trembled on the wheel. He did remember the sweater. He remembered wearing it the day of the accident. But he never told anyone about it, and the sweater itself had been lost in the chaos that followed his mother's death. You're not real, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. You're some kind of, I don't know, a hallucination. I've been driving too long, that's all. I should have stopped at that last truck stop. The blue mug, Eleanor said suddenly. The one with the chip on the handle. Every morning you checked to make sure I was using it for my coffee. You were convinced it was lucky, that something bad would happen if I used any other mug. Daniel's vision blurred, and he blinked hard against unexpected tears. The blue mug had shattered the morning of the accident. He remembered the sound of it breaking, remembered his mother's apology as she swept up the pieces. Remembered the cold dread that had settled in his stomach, the certainty that something terrible was coming. I should have listened to you that day, Eleanor whispered. You begged me not to drive to town. You said you had a bad feeling. But I didn't listen. Mothers are supposed to know better, aren't they? We're supposed to protect our children, not the other way around. The truck's radio suddenly crackled to life, but instead of static or talk radio, a familiar melody filled the cab. You are my sunshine, played on piano, slightly out of tune. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. It was the lullaby his mother used to play on their old upright piano, the one that had been sold along with everything else after her death. "Your father used to complain about that piano," Eleanor said, smiling at the music. "Said I played it too late at night, that it kept him from sleeping. But he never really minded. He'd sit in his armchair, pretending to read his newspaper, but I'd catch him watching me play. He loved us so much back then, Daniel. Before." She trailed off, and the music faded back to static. Daniel realized he'd been holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly. The air in the cab had grown so cold he could see ice crystals forming on the inside of the windshield. "Before what?" he heard himself ask, though every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to stop, to pull over, to wake himself up from whatever nightmare this was. Eleanor turned to look at him fully then, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, her face seemed to shift between young and old, between the mother he remembered and the elderly woman who had flagged him down. "There are things you need to know, little bear. Things I couldn't tell you then. About your father. About that day on the bridge. About why I've been waiting so long to find you." A sign loomed out of the darkness ahead. Exit 23 Millbrook. The town he'd grown up in, the place he'd sworn never to return to. Without touching the wheel, the truck began to drift toward the exit ramp. "No," Daniel said firmly, fighting the wheel as the truck seemed drawn to the exit like a magnet to steel. "I'm not going back there. I have a delivery to make, deadlines to meet." But even as he spoke, the GPS screen on his dashboard flickered and went dark, only to reboot with a new destination. Home 7.3 miles. Eleanor's voice took on an edge he remembered from childhood, the tone that meant there would be no arguing. "Some deadlines matter more than others, Daniel. Some deliveries can't wait 30 years. The exit ramp loomed closer, and Daniel felt the wheel turning beneath his hands as if guided by an invisible force. The more he fought it, the colder the cab became, until he could barely feel his fingers on the steering wheel. The truck's engine growled deeper, a sound he'd never heard it make before, as if some ancient machine had awakened within it. "This isn't possible," he muttered, watching as his GPS recalculated a route he'd spent decades trying to forget. The screen showed streets he used to bike down as a child: Maple Grove Road, where he'd had his first paper route; Lancaster Avenue, where his best friend Tommy used to live; and finally, Cedar Street, where his childhood home had stood before the city demolished it to make way for a strip mall. "Nothing is impossible, little bear," Eleanor said softly. "Just improbable. Like a mother's love surviving death. Like memories buried so deep they turn to ghosts." She reached out as if to touch his arm, but her hand passed through him, leaving a trail of cold that seeped into his bones. Like the truth refusing to stay buried. The radio crackled again, but this time instead of the lullaby, it picked up fragments of what sounded like an old news broadcast. "Tragic accident on Miller's Bridge. Vehicle found. Investigation ongoing." The words faded in and out like a badly tuned station, but they sent shivers down Daniel's spine. "That bridge was torn down years ago," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he saw it appearing through the curtain of snow ahead: Miller's Bridge, its rusted guardrails and crumbling concrete exactly as he remembered them from that fatal day. "This isn't real. None of this is real. Reality," Eleanor mused, "is more flexible than we like to think. Especially on nights like this, when the veil between what was and what is grows thin." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting something more than just the dashboard lights now. They seemed to hold entire worlds of sadness. "Your father knew that. He knew all about the things that hide in the spaces between what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore." The truck's headlights illuminated the bridge's entrance, the beams catching the swirling snow in a way that made it look like they were driving through stars. Daniel's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them on the wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to floor the accelerator and run as far as he could. But something stronger than fear kept him moving forward, a need he'd carried for 30 years, a question that had haunted every mile he'd driven since that day. "What really happened that morning, Mom?" The words slipped out before he could stop it, and the moment it left his lips, the entire truck shuddered as if struck by an invisible force. Eleanor's form seemed to flicker like a candle flame in the wind. "Your father was a good man once, Daniel. But good men can do terrible things when they're afraid. When they think they're protecting their families." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out what looked like an old envelope, yellowed with age. "He found my letters that morning. The ones I'd written to Detective Morrison about the money, about the missing girls from the factory." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He remembered the factory, the old textile mill on the edge of town where his father had worked as head of security. It had closed down the year after his mother died, but he remembered the headlines that had circulated before then, about young women who had disappeared after taking jobs there. "The accident," Eleanor continued, her voice growing urgent as the truck approached the middle of the bridge, "wasn't an accident at all. Your father followed us that morning. He was waiting. When I saw his truck in my rearview mirror, I knew. I tried to protect you, tried to turn around, but..." The truck's engine suddenly died, leaving them stranded in the middle of Miller's Bridge. The snow stopped falling, frozen in midair like suspended diamonds. In the absolute silence that followed, Daniel could hear the creaking of the old bridge beneath them, the sound of water flowing somewhere in the darkness below. "But what about me?" he whispered, a childhood memory surfacing with terrible clarity, not of the crash itself, but of the moments before. Of his father's truck appearing behind them, of his mother's panicked face in the rearview mirror, of her desperate attempt to unbuckle his seatbelt and push him out of the car before the impact. "You saved me. Why don't I remember?" "The mind protects itself, little bear. Like a mother protects her child. Some memories are too heavy for a young heart to carry." Eleanor's form began to fade slightly, becoming more translucent as she spoke. "But now you're ready. Now you need to know. Take us home, Daniel. Take us to where the truth has been waiting all these years." The truck's engine roared back to life on its own, and the GPS screen flashed with a new message. "Arriving at destination 0.8 miles. Ahead, through the curtain of frozen snow, Daniel could see the warm glow of a porch light that shouldn't exist, marking a house that had been demolished decades ago. His childhood home was waiting. The truck's brakes hissed to a stop in front of 1247 Cedar Street. Daniel sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at the impossible scene before him. The two-story Victorian home stood exactly as it had in his childhood, faded blue paint peeling slightly around the window frames, white gingerbread trim along the roof's edge, and his mother's prized rose bushes, somehow blooming despite the winter snow. "This isn't..." he started, but when he turned to the passenger seat, Eleanor was gone. Through the swirling snow, he could see her standing on the front porch, her form flickering like an old film projection. The porch swing where he'd spent countless summer evenings reading comic books creaked gently in a wind he couldn't feel. Daniel's legs felt like lead as he climbed down from the cab. Each step toward the house sent waves of memories crashing over him. The smell of his mother's Sunday pot roast, the sound of her piano playing floating through open windows, the warmth of summer afternoons spent building elaborate blanket forts in the living room. But beneath these comfortable memories lurked darker ones, like shadows beneath still water. His father's late-night phone calls, hushed arguments behind closed doors, and strange men in suits visiting the house when they thought Daniel was asleep. The porch steps groaned under his weight, each one singing out a familiar note he'd forgotten he knew. Eleanor waited by the front door, her form more solid now, though he could still see the faint glow of the porch light through her silhouette. "Some houses," she said softly, "hold on to memories so tightly they refuse to be torn down. They exist in the spaces between what was and what is, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets." She gestured to the door, which swung open on its own with a creak that echoed through Daniel's bones. The interior stopped him dead in his tracks. Everything was exactly as it had been the morning of the accident: his father's newspaper folded on the armchair, his mother's coffee cup, a replacement for the lucky blue one, sitting half full on the side table, his own schoolbooks scattered across the dining room table where he'd been working on homework the night before. "How is this possible?" Daniel whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The air inside was heavy with the scent of his mother's lavender perfume, mixed with the musty sweetness of old wood and memories. Eleanor moved through the house like a ghost through time, her form shifting between the elderly woman who'd flagged him down and the mother he remembered. Time isn't as linear as we think, little bear. Sometimes it loops back on itself, creating pockets where past and present intersect. Your father understood this better than most. It's why he chose this house in the first place. Daniel followed her into his father's study, a room he'd been forbidden to enter as a child. The walls were lined with books he'd never noticed before, their spines bearing titles and languages he didn't recognize. On the desk sat an old leather journal, its pages yellow with age. Your father wasn't just head of security at the factory, Eleanor said, her voice taking on an edge of steel he'd never heard before. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of doorways that should have remained closed. The factory wasn't just making textiles, they were weaving something else. Something darker. Daniel picked up the journal with trembling hands. Inside, his father's familiar handwriting filled page after page with strange symbols and diagrams. Between the arcane notes were newspaper clippings about missing girls, all factory workers, all young, all vanished without a trace. I found this journal 3 days before the accident, Eleanor continued. I'd been investigating the disappearances on my own, working with Detective Morrison. When I discovered what your father was involved in, the rituals, the sacrifices, the doors they were trying to open, I knew I had to stop them. But I underestimated how far they would go to keep their secrets. A floorboard creaked behind them, and Daniel spun around to find himself facing his old bedroom door. Through the gap beneath it, a faint blue light pulsed like a heartbeat. There's something you need to see, Eleanor said, moving toward the door. Something I hid the morning of the accident, when I realized your father had discovered my investigation. The door swung open to reveal Daniel's childhood bedroom, preserved like a museum exhibit. His model airplanes still hung from the ceiling, their shadows dancing in the strange blue light that seemed to emanate from a shoebox partially hidden under his bed. Daniel approached the box as if in a trance, aware of his mother's presence behind him, her form growing more solid with each step he took. The box contained a stack of letters bound with twine, several photographs that made his blood run cold, and a small key that seemed to hum with its own energy. The factory's real ledger, Eleanor explained. Proof of everything they did, every girl they took, every ritual they performed. Your father and his associates thought they'd destroyed all the evidence, but I'd been making copies for months. Detective Morrison had the other set, but he disappeared the day after I hid these. They made him vanish, just like the others. Daniel's hands shook as he examined the photographs, images of strange symbols carved into factory walls, of hooded figures performing rituals in the basement, and most disturbing of all, a photograph of his father standing among them, his face illuminated by an unnatural light. The accident, Daniel said slowly, pieces of memory falling into place like shards of broken glass, wasn't just about silencing you, was it? They needed a sacrifice. Something more powerful than the other girls. Eleanor's form flickered violently, and for a moment Daniel could see through her to the wall behind. A mother's love, she whispered, is one of the most powerful forces in any world. They thought they could use my death to open a door that should have stayed closed forever. But they didn't count on one thing. What's that? Daniel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. A mother's love doesn't end with death, little bear. And neither does her need for justice. The blue light from the box suddenly intensified, filling the room with its otherworldly glow. In its illumination, Daniel could see tears streaming down his mother's face, real tears, leaving real tracks on suddenly solid cheeks. It's time, she said, her voice stronger now than it had been all night. Time to finish what I started 30 years ago. Time to close the door they opened with my blood. But I can't do it alone, Daniel. I need my little bear one last time. The blue light from the box pulsed like a living thing, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Daniel clutched the leather journal in one hand and the stack of letters in the other, his mother's last pieces of evidence against a conspiracy that had claimed her life. The temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that his breath came out in visible clouds, but he barely noticed the cold anymore. "Dad's still alive, isn't he?" Daniel asked, though it wasn't really a question. Something in him had always known, had always felt his father's presence like a shadow at the edge of his consciousness. The countless times he thought he'd seen a familiar figure watching his truck from highway overpasses, the mysterious hang-up calls at every holiday, the strange gifts that would appear on his doorstep on his birthday, always wrapped in the same brown paper his father had used for Christmas presents. Eleanor's form solidified further, and now she looked exactly as she had the morning of the accident, younger, stronger, wearing the lavender sweater she'd always favored. "Yes," she said quietly. "He's where he's always been. At the factory." "But the factory was demolished," Daniel protested. "Years ago. They built a shopping center." "Did they?" Eleanor interrupted, moving to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, frozen in midair like suspended stars. Through the crystalline curtain, Daniel could see the factory's silhouette against the night sky, a hulking Victorian-era building of red brick and black iron, its windows glowing with the same otherworldly blue light that emanated from the box. Like this house, some places refuse to be erased. They exist in the spaces between, waiting. Your father and his associates, they've been there all this time, continuing their work, opening doors that should stay closed, taking more girls. Daniel moved to stand beside her at the window, and as he did, memories he'd suppressed for 30 years came flooding back. The night before the accident, he'd woken to voices downstairs, his mother on the phone with Detective Morrison, her voice urgent but controlled. "I have proof now," she'd been saying. "Names, dates, photographs. Everything they did in that basement, every girl they took. The symbols they carved into the walls, the rituals they performed. James doesn't know I found his journal. Tomorrow morning, I'm taking everything to the state police. This has to end." But James had known. Somehow he'd known. "The bridge," Daniel said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "You tried to turn around when you saw his truck behind us. You weren't driving toward the bridge, you were trying to get away from it." Eleanor nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks in the supernatural cold. "I knew what they would do if they caught us. What the ritual required. A willing sacrifice is powerful, but a mother's unwilling sacrifice, torn from her child? That's the kind of power that can tear holes in the world." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with an inner light. "But they didn't count on a mother's love being stronger than their rituals. They didn't count on me finding a way back, finding a way to protect you even after death." Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the journal, turning to the last written page. His father's handwriting had grown increasingly erratic, the symbols more complex and disturbing. The final entry was dated just last week. "The door weakens. After 30 years, the sacrifice's power fades. We need the boy. The son's blood will complete what the mother's began. He drives the long roads alone. It would be easy to make it look like an accident. They've been watching me," Daniel whispered. "All these years. Waiting for the right moment." "Yes," Eleanor said grimly. "But so have I. Every truck stop where you felt someone watching over you, every near miss with a drunk driver that seemed to swerve away at the last second, every storm you somehow drove through safely, that was me, Little Bear. I couldn't stop what they did to me, but I've spent 30 years making sure they couldn't get to you." The box's blue light suddenly flared brighter, and the letters inside began to glow with their own inner fire. Daniel pulled them out with shaking hands, and as he did, he saw that the words on the pages had changed. Where once there had been his mother's careful documentation of the factory's crimes, now there were different words, written in a script that seemed to move and shift as he watched. "The ritual can be undone. The door can be closed. But it requires a different kind of sacrifice, a willing offering of truth, of memory, of justice too long delayed." Eleanor's form grew more solid with each word Daniel read, until she seemed almost fully corporeal. "Your father and his people tried to use death to open a door to something terrible," she said. But they never understood that love is stronger than death, that truth is more powerful than any ritual. Those girls they took, their spirits are still trapped in that factory, powering their spells, keeping their doors open. But tonight, with the evidence we have, with the truth finally revealed. She reached out and took Daniel's hand. For the first time since she'd appeared on the highway, he could feel her touch, warm, solid, real. We can set them free. All of them. But I need your help, little bear. One last time, I need you to be brave for me. Through the window, the factory's blue light pulsed like a beacon, calling them. In his other hand, the journal's pages began to burn with a cold fire that didn't consume the paper. And somewhere in the distance, a truck's engine roared to life, but whether it was his own rig or his father's, Daniel couldn't tell. The truth was finally within reach, but he knew claiming it would come at a price. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. They can only be transformed into different kinds of openings, different kinds of truths. The factory loomed before them, its brick walls bleeding shadows into the frozen night. Daniel's truck had somehow transported itself from his childhood home to the factory's entrance, its engine idling with an otherworldly purr. The building's windows pulsed with that same blue light, like dying stars trapped behind dirty glass. "They're waiting for us," Eleanor said, her form now completely solid as she stood beside the truck. "Your father knows we're here. He's always known this night would come." She held the leather journal in one hand and the box of letters in the other, both objects glowing with an inner light that seemed to respond to her touch. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "All these years," he said, "I thought I was running away. But I was really just running in a circle, wasn't I? Coming back to this moment." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Sometimes the longest road leads us right back home, little bear. But this time, you're not a helpless child. This time, we face it together." The factory doors creaked open on their own, spilling blue light across the snow-covered parking lot. Inside, shadows moved against the light, taking shapes that made Daniel's eyes hurt to look at them. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a figure he'd both dreaded and longed to see for 30 years, his father. James Cross looked exactly as Daniel remembered him, as if the past 3 decades had been a dream. He wore the same security uniform, the same stern expression, but his eyes now burned with an unnatural blue fire. "My son!" James called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot like a physical force. "And my dear Eleanor! The family reunion I've waited so long for." He spread his arms wide, and the shadows behind him writhed and twisted. "Come inside. There's so much I want to show you." Daniel felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, warm and strong. "Remember," she whispered, "love is stronger than their rituals. Truth is more powerful than their magic. And a mother's protection?" She squeezed his shoulder. "That's the strongest magic of all." They stepped out of the truck together, the snow crunching under their feet in perfect synchronization. As they approached the factory entrance, Daniel could see other figures emerging from the shadows, men in suits he half remembered from his childhood, their faces aged but their eyes burning with the same blue fire as his father's. "The door is waiting," James said, gesturing to a staircase that led down into darkness. "The ritual chamber where it all began. Where your mother's sacrifice opened the first crack between worlds. With your blood, son, we can open it permanently. Think of the power we could wield together, as father and son." But Daniel wasn't looking at his father anymore. Behind the men in suits, in the deeper shadows of the factory floor, he could see other figures taking shape, young women in factory uniforms from different decades, their forms transparent but their eyes clear and accusing. The missing girls his mother had tried to save, their spirits trapped here all these years. "No," Daniel said, his voice stronger than he'd expected. "That's not why I'm here." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the photographs from the box, the ones showing the ritual chamber, the symbols, the evidence his mother had died trying to expose. As he held them up, they began to glow with the same blue light that filled the factory. "I'm here for the truth," he continued, taking a step forward. "I'm here for justice. For my mother, And for all the other mothers who lost their daughters to your rituals. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her form blazing now with a light that wasn't blue at all, but pure white. The spirits of the missing girls began to move too, drifting forward, their own forms growing stronger. You can't stop what's already been set in motion, James snarled, but there was fear in his voice now. The doors reopened. Can be closed, Eleanor interrupted. With a different kind of sacrifice. Not of blood or life, but of truth. Of justice. She held up the journal and letters, which burst into white flame. The evidence doesn't have to be hidden anymore, James. The truth doesn't have to stay buried. The factory walls began to shake as Eleanor spoke, the blue light flickering and fading as a new light grew, warm, clean, and bright as dawn. The spirits of the missing girls moved closer, their faces set with determination. Little Bear, Eleanor said softly. It's time for one last ride. Time to take us all home. Daniel understood. He reached out and took his mother's hand, and together they walked past his father, past the men in suits, down into the ritual chamber below. The spirits of the girls followed, a procession of light in the darkness. In the chamber, the symbols his father had carved into the walls 3 decades ago still glowed with that sickly blue fire. But as Eleanor began to read from the journal and letters, her voice rising in a song of truth and memory, the symbols began to change. The blue light faded, replaced by the warm light that seemed to emanate from the spirits themselves. James and his associates tried to stop them, but they couldn't cross the circle of light that had formed around Daniel and his mother. The truth, spoken aloud after 30 years of silence, had its own power, stronger than any ritual, more binding than any sacrifice. One by one, the spirits of the missing girls began to fade, not into darkness this time, but into light. They were finally free, their stories told, their justice obtained. The symbols on the walls crumbled like ancient paint, revealing clean stone beneath. When it was over, when the last spirit had found her peace, Eleanor turned to Daniel. She was fading too now, but not like before. This time, she glowed with the same warm light that had freed the others. It's time for my last ride too, Little Bear, she said, touching his cheek. Time to take me home. They left his father and the others in the chamber, their power broken, their ritual undone. The police would find them there later, along with all the evidence they needed, the journal, the letters, the photographs, preserved by whatever power had kept them hidden all these years. Daniel drove his truck one last time through the frozen night, his mother beside him in the passenger seat. But this time, they weren't headed for his childhood home or the factory. Instead, they drove to the small cemetery on the edge of town, where a headstone had stood neglected for 30 years. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Eleanor Cross faded for the last time, not into darkness or even into light, but into peace. The truth had finally been told, justice had been served, and a mother's love had proved stronger than any dark ritual. Daniel stood alone by the headstone, watching the sun rise. He wasn't really alone though, he never had been. His mother's love had been with him all along, guiding him through the long dark nights, keeping him safe on endless roads, waiting for the moment when he would be ready to face the truth. He placed a single forget-me-not flower on the grave, the same kind she'd worn as a brooch when she'd first appeared on that snowy highway. Then he climbed back into his truck, ready to face the road ahead, knowing that some passengers never truly leave us, and some journeys don't end but simply transform into different kinds of beginnings.